Hi everyone, it's Saralise here with John Hill. John Ichiro Hill, is that how you
That's
say it?
right. Exactly, Ichiro.
Awesome. Yay. And I've known John for 11 years now. Yeah, I think 11
Yes.
years. And we met in Mount Shasta, and now he lives in Mount Shasta, and I used to live in Mount Shasta. So both of us have a unique perspective on ascension and the historical galactic history of the universe and like how everything kind of works and what's happening in relation to that, in relation to current events right now in the world. And we wanted to bring you some of that perspective because it to me it feels important to understand a little bit more about the larger picture, the macro, as opposed to the world stage and the micro and what we're seeing reflect itself in reality, quote unquote, the movie that we're watching. Because it literally is like a movie that we're watching. And so I just want to hear a little bit about your, like, John, if you want to just share your background and what you thrive in, what makes you excited in life, and what your passions are in terms of studying this information. Go for it. Just tell a little bit about yourself.
Well, I think of myself as being relatively new to all of this. I mean, I have been apolitical. I've never involved myself in anything political. And I would say that I was pretty brainwashed for many, many years.
Mm.
Um,
How were
and
you? How were you brainwashed?
well, in terms of not really understanding the reality of what was going on with you could call them the Illuminati, the Anunnaki. I mean, the history
Right.
of our civilization and what was going on behind the scenes, especially politically, because
Right.
I had no idea. I mean, probably the first inkling that I had was 9/11.
Right.
Because 9/11 became just so obvious, and I had friends in LA where I was living at the time that began to open my eyes.
Yeah, you and I were living in LA during that event in 2001. We were
Yeah,
both living in LA.
and it was powerful. And then some people were saying, well, and just started looking at this and saying, well, never in the history of the world has a skyscraper ever fallen down as a
Collapsed.
result of a collapse, as a result of fires. And
Or
so a lot of
planes
stuff.
flying through.
Exactly, exactly. So I had an inkling there, but then again, I just got involved with my day-to-day life, and I was very much involved in tantra at the time, which for me was a very spiritual, transformative kind of experience.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was involved more with my own life and pretty self-focused at that time. But then years later, what's very interesting is that I hadn't, I was on Facebook for many years, when it first came out,
Mm-hmm.
but I never involved myself in it. I never used it. I just had my name and my profile and all that stuff. And then I started marketing myself, and I had traveled around, and I had returned to LA because I was going to do some sort of reality show, which never got off the ground. But
Right.
I started getting on Facebook to start marketing myself. Well, lo and behold, I started getting involved. I looked at posts. I would go posting things about myself and my project and all of this stuff. And lo and behold, 2016 primary came around, and Bernie Sanders showed up.
Mm.
And he was a breath of fresh air. And I thought, oh my God, I like this guy. He seems really
Right.
authentic. And I actually voted for him. I actually volunteered. I donated money. I mean, I did all this stuff
Wow.
because I just got excited about him. But then it turned out, and as a result, I started reading more and more online posts about Bernie Sanders, about Hillary Clinton. I discovered Hillary Clinton's past, and I just started going deeper and deeper into this. Well, I guess you could call it
Rabbit
a
hole.
rabbit hole. Exactly, and was severely disappointed when he did not get the nomination, and he actually kind of sold out.
For
And
sure.
I ignored everything on the Republican side because, the Republicans are bad and they're never good.
Right.
And I was kind of like a
Exactly.
lifelong Democrat and all this stuff. But I started going deeper, and then I discovered David Icke, and then he was the deep rabbit hole. And I started watching everything that he was doing. He'd been doing it for years. I started reading his books, and then I discovered all these other people, and that was kind of how I opened my eyes. And then several years later, because I kind of ignored.
What year was that? Like when you discovered David?
It was David Icke was 2016.
Okay.
Yeah, and then 2017, towards the end of 2017, actually close to the beginning of 2018, I discovered Trump, and I discovered Trump through one of the YouTubers who told me about Q.
Right, QAnon.
And then that kind of like opened my eyes a little bit, and I thought, okay, I'm suspicious, but
right. But let me
investigate
anyway, because
yeah,
kind of interesting.
yes. And so then that's how I kind of came to Trump.
Yeah.
Although I didn't really like him,
right.
He seemed like a buffoon, and
he's the egomaniac, blah blah blah. Right.
Yeah, blah blah blah. Yeah. And so I finally went deeper with all of it, and I just started doing research like 10, 12 hours a day. And
wow. Yeah. Mind-blowing, right?
It was mind-blowing. The whole journey was mind-blowing. And it just became so important because I started seeing that we were at a crossroads in our civilization. This country is a model for the world in many ways.
It really is, yeah.
And so it just became very important to me, and I kind of put aside everything else that I was doing, and focused on the research, and kept thinking, how can I contribute in my small way to the movement?
Right.
So that's basically my journey, and I'm a coach, and I feel like there's something that I can do to help people. Because we're living in a very stressful time.
Yeah.
Where people are, this is a hard pill for a lot of people to swallow. So
for sure,
whatever I can do to help people consciously realize what's actually going on in this world.
Right. So in reflection of my interactions with you, I just want to share this so people understand how I connected with you. So I met you, I think in Mount Shasta, on the street, or I don't remember how exactly we met, but you gave me a CD of your 3 meditations, which were interlinked with each other. And I took it home and I went through the process. And through that meditation, I discovered what I called my myth, right? And, I was already a deeply spiritual person at that point in 2009. I was already on my path and very, very deeply involved in ascension and doing retreats and things of that nature. I was just coming from Los Angeles to Mount Shasta. I had a ministry, the Legion of Light Global Ministries at the time. And so for me, I was like, ooh, a piece of, spiritual awesomeness. Let's check this out. Because I could feel it from you that it was authentic and truth. And like, I'm very discerning about what I expose myself to energetically, right? It's very important for me not to expose myself to a false prophet or someone who's going to try to usurp energy from the person or from someone who is technically a recipient of their whatever. So for me, I'm very, very consciously aware of how I interact with pieces of material offerings from other people, that kind of stuff, right? That's very important to me. So when I met you, I was like, oh, this guy's the real deal. Period.
Thank you.
You know, like, yeah, of course. And I was very clear about that. I was like, okay, he's the real deal. I feel like I can trust this offering. So I went through the process of this meditation, and I had this incredible experience where I went deep into theta, right? Even probably further than theta, into sort of an omega state, very deep. And I'm calling it omega, but it's not omega, but you know, like gamma waves, you know what I mean? Like seriously cosmic. And I had this whole download about overseeing the development of the human form and being the creator of the humanoid form with wings and all the things, right? And the archangelic form also, specifically like at the beginning, right? And this is before I knew about the Emerald Order and that I was one of the firstborns and like all this other stuff that I discovered, hence that since that point, right? I had already had somebody tell me that I was a firstborn, or that I was one of the founders of this particular universe. And then I found out I was a firstborn, you know, like all this stuff about being a source being, but not being embodied at that point, right? Like not being fully in my power and fully embodied. That meditation literally shifted me in a way that I remember very distinctly thinking to myself, oh my God, this is actually real. Like I am actually experiencing an aspect of what went down in my soul's experience. Like, and I had past lives, but this was like, you know, going back, way back, right? So for me, that was like a huge moment of realizing. And then I was, of course, in Mount Shasta. So I'm just arriving in Mount Shasta at this point. Like I literally just showed up from Los Angeles. You know, like I was totally shifting out of LA-ness into humility for the first time in my life, and really understanding that I didn't have to be all that. I could just be anonymous and be a normal human being. So it was like a combination of me stepping out of my ego into my power, right? Into my realness of what I actually am as a soul. So there was this like moment where that came into my field. The spirit was like, here you go. Here's this piece of information that's going to help you. So I have done since then. I still have it on my iTunes, actually. I think I should check, but I still have that meditation. Sometimes I've gone back over the past 11 years and I've done it again to see if I get more information. And of course I have. Right. So it's just really awesome that that moment in time happened with us, and that we've stayed connected all these years as friends, and we haven't really talked to each other much, but there's just this knowingness about our souls and our connection with each other. And I am so deeply grateful and bonded to those people, right? Like I feel resonant with certain frequencies, and I stay connected to those people, and I'm consistent in terms of staying connected to those people, whether we talk or not. There's an energetic, like, zoom, there's a grounding there. And I feel that about you. And I feel like you're a soulmate, like you're in the same soul fabric. Right.
Right.
And so for me, that's important in terms of who I bring into my field and who I interact with and have these conversations with, which I was going to do a podcast called Consensual Conversations, which is all about this. Like we're consenting to having this conversation. And what is this about? Let's have it. Let's talk about the hard things. Let's talk about the things that nobody wants to talk about. But now we're at a point where that's all we can talk about right now, because it's that important that we actually need to have those conversations. So it's no longer about having a consensual conversation. It's about having the conversation, period. So here we are. And one of the things that has been very prevalent in my field, I've been apolitical my entire life. If I was anything, I would be the most liberal you could possibly be. Like I'm literally like, everything goes, you know, everything's great. Just let people be their sovereign beingness, you know.
Yeah, me too.
And I left the US and was an expat for almost 3 years. Okay. I left in 2016 and came back midsummer 2018. So it was like 2 years, 2 and something. But I was not coming back. I was not coming back. And I chose to come back for my son. And I'm glad that I did. I'm super grateful that I came back for that reason. So what's interesting is that now it's political. The stage is political. And in the election years before this, I just could not be bothered. I was like, I got to get I'm done with this country. This is ridiculous. I am not interested in being a part of this any longer. This is ridiculous. Like, I need to get out, you know, and I had things to do, you know, things to do. And so speaking to the Anunnaki, and so here's what's important to me to talk about in relation to that, is that we have certain beings that are controlling the narrative, right? I'll just say the narrative, because the narrative can be many things, but there is a certain group of people that are connected to certain beings that are attempting to control the narrative to keep the entire society of planet Earth in disempowerment, out of their sovereignty, out of their personal integrity, and in a place of victimization, right? And being in a follower consciousness and just going along with whatever the narrative is. Now, there's plenty of people saying, excuse me, hi, I'm a sovereign being, and that's not going to work for me. And more people are waking up from the mind control mechanisms that are being implanted into the narrative. And it's making a difference. And then there's people doing spiritual work, lifting the veil off of the narrative, lifting the dark magic spells, and working overtime in terms of dismantling the narrative that is a false narrative, right? And then once you get to this certain place, you realize that the narrative is completely false. And wait a minute, there's all this other information outside of the narrative that's real life. And once you get there, then your mind goes, poof. But before you get there, it is really tough to believe that there's anything outside of the narrative. Because the narrative is all of life. It's been infiltrated into every aspect of our reality.
Exactly. You see, I come from a scientific background.
My father 3D, too.
Yeah, 3D scientific background. And I actually have a degree in physics and a master's in engineering.
So you know, in what engineering?
Master's in electrical engineering.
So my dad was a chemical engineer, and my sister is an astrophysicist, rocket scientist.
Okay.
That's where I come from, top secret Navy.
Oh, all right.
So still.
So what you were saying about, everything about reality is topsy-turvy. It's like pretty much everything is a lie. and so I started discovering things scientifically, because I started looking at the science and the physics and realizing that astrophysics, astronomy, the universe, and our view of the universe is wrong. It's false. It all shifted, and actually Einstein was wrong. So it's everything.
This is what I've been saying for years. Okay, keep going. Oh my God.
So one of the big ones that I started exploring is the electric universe and the Thunderbolts project.
Wow.
And so, and again, this was from David Icke, and I can't say that I got this on my own, but I started exploring it and realizing, just from my own scientific background, that there are paradigms that we are stuck in. And once you're in a paradigm, it's really hard to come out of that paradigm. There's a great book called Structure of Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn, who talks about
Structure of revolutions?
The structure of scientific revolutions.
Oh, wow.
And he talks about paradigms and how difficult it is that at first there are a few people that are pioneers, and they say, well, it's kind of like Earth being the center of the universe, that the sun's going around the Earth.
Right.
And so it took centuries before people realized that was not true. And so we
don't know if that's not true or not.
Well, again, there are layers and layers.
There's so many layers. Just saying, there's so many layers. We don't actually know if the Earth is flat or round. We don't, at this point in time, we don't actually know what is true.
Yeah, I've gone down those rabbit holes too.
Right, so have I. And so I have a very distinct, so this is interesting. In my own experience, I have a very distinct memory of several different aspects of that because I've been off planet, right? So for me, it's like, okay, what do I remember seeing? And what's interesting is I have screen memories that were implanted, and then I have real memories, right? And then my father being connected to NASA and my cousin being Neil Armstrong, and me questioning my cousin as a child and him being skitzed out and looking over his shoulder, right? So I started at a very young age, I started questioning all of that. Like, what is really going on here? My dad knows something that nobody else knows, and my dad is the author of the Sidewinder missile. We need to look at that for a minute here. My cousin is Neil Armstrong and walked on the moon. What's really going on here? And then me watching the interviews with my cousin and my father not being online at all. Not a trace. Top secret, right? But him never getting the credit that he deserved for what he actually was a part of. That was frustrating for me, that somebody else's name was on the authorship of what he actually oversaw the development and creation of with thousands of people for 40 years of his life. I mean, not that it's good necessarily because it's, deep to the state, but just to understand that, like, my father never got, he wrote an engineering book in the 50s. I mean, his name was on every document in the Navy, like in relation to, China Lake, which is where all the mind control experiments happen. You understand? So for me, it's like, oh my God, all the stuff that I experienced as a child is confirmed for me now because, now there's information about China Lake. Now there's information about Project Paperclip being in relation to China Lake, and all of those levels of what I experienced and have memories of. It's not my imagination, And so we come back to this understanding of the earth and what has been imprinted upon our field, which started in 1957. Actually, prior to that, with Eisenhower and the treaty between, the Draco-Reptilian clan and Eisenhower, which was, I believe, done under duress for them to have access to our biomatter, right? And then that treaty was renewed every 10 years. I know I'm going off on a tangent, but just roll with me for a second.
Yeah.
So, right, I'm on a tangent. So, so every 10 years, that treaty was renewed. Okay. But the interesting part about that is that every 10 years, that treaty got more and more access to human beings. And so now, where we were prior to the administration that we have now was completely, we had gone down the rabbit hole, deep into the darkness, into the dark age, I like to call it. And it was revealed, and it was showing up in our reality. We could see it. The veils had been lifted. I helped lift those veils in 2015, 2016. And then all of a sudden it was like, you could see it everywhere, and they were open about it, and they didn't care at all that everybody was watching them. You know, like the Grammys and the Illuminati, like ritual on television, and then all the children being exposed to all this information and all the satanic ritual that's coming through the airwaves in the narrative for everyone to witness and be absorbing, and to actually, the veil was just like, they had a spell on everybody. We were all asleep. Like, okay, we're just going to let this happen? No. Right? And so it's important to understand that this was a spell, that we were under a spell from, most likely the controlling aspect of it would have been from 9/11, 2001. Right?
Yeah, that was the big sacrifice.
But that was the day, here comes the interesting part. That was the day that the global financial reset was actually supposed to go into action, and that the US dollar was going to be backed by gold, and that NESARA was going to take effect. NESARA had already been signed into law by Clinton, under duress, of course, by the White Hats. And this is right after JFK Jr. died, when he was running for Senate against Hillary. So it's all there. Everything is there. The NSA has recorded every single aspect of this. So now we have proof and evidence of what has gone down behind the scenes for the last 20 years. Right? Now, in relation to what you have in your consciousness around the scientific aspect of this, how would you say that your observation of what's going on the earth, in terms of, you said, in terms of astrophysics and physics and engineering, in terms of what the narrative is and what's really going on, what do you see? You were starting to get into that, and I'm redirecting, and now I'm going back to that. What do you see in terms of politics as well, in terms of how that all plays out?
Well, the scientific aspect was simply, I was speaking to the idea that everything that we've been told is a lie. I mean, right. in essence.
By observable physics and science, right? It's a lie. What we're being told.
Yeah, I mean,
that's the physical observation.
Well, the biggest thing about science is that if you have a theory or a hypothesis, then you should be able to predict what will happen in a certain situation.
And you should be able to prove what's already present, right?
Well, to prove the hypothesis.
Right, but you should also be able to prove scientifically what's fact and what isn't, like by observation.
Well, everything is a hypothesis.
Right.
They talk about settled science, but there's no such thing as settled science, because you have a theory or a hypothesis, and then you predict something, and then you do the experiment to see if that prediction is true or not.
And you can prove it.
And if it's true, then you know that the hypothesis or the theory that you have is probably a good one. Now, right. One of the things that I've noticed is that over the years, we've sent things out in space, and, comets are probably one of the big ones. So the idea of a comet is that's a snowball, a dirty snowball. But it turns out that they've actually looked at comets, and they found out that they're not dirty snowballs. They weren't
Are they balls of fire?
No, they're just metal objects.
Huh.
And the whole idea behind the electric universe theory is that the sun does not have a thermonuclear furnace, that is actually electrical in nature, and it's the
Yes.
surface of the sun that is electrical, and it works kind of like an anode, and the rest of the universe is a cathode, and it creates the energy that we see, and it's not thermonuclear at all.
So
So
it's not fire that we're seeing. It's
not fire.
electricity.
It's electricity.
That makes
Everything is
total
electrical.
sense.
And then if it goes on,
My mind just went. Yes.
So there's a whole bunch of things where astronomers are saying this doesn't make sense. But then if you use the electric universe theories
It makes perfect
to explain
sense.
it makes perfect sense. So that's just a simple way of looking at
So
things.
why wouldn't they use the electrical universe theory and teach that? What would be the purpose of them teaching something else that's thermonuclear? So, for example, they say that 250,000 years ago, there was a thermonuclear explosion on Mars.
Exactly. Yeah. And
I disagree.
Exactly.
I do not think that's what happened at all because I was there. Right?
Well,
I think it happened like on another timeline. And I don't believe it was a thermonuclear explosion. I believe it was something entirely different because I was there.
Well, there's actually another very interesting theory is that this Earth actually revolved around Saturn. That Saturn,
black sun situation.
Saturn was a sun.
Right.
Was
what
our
happened
sun.
to Saturn? And how
that Saturn
the rings are really interesting to me.
Well, what's interesting is that the water that's around the rings of Saturn, they're made up of water droplets, okay? And the water has the same isotopic nature as the water on Earth.
That makes total sense to me.
So that really says that we probably did revolve around Saturn, and that Saturn was the sun, but it was captured by our current sun.
Okay.
And
captured into the orbit, you mean?
Yeah, captured into the orbit of the sun that we have now. And then when it came in, it disrupted everything within Saturn, and that Saturn actually, in order to electrically, there was a discharge, and in order to discharge, it released some what they call a CME. It's a coronal mass discharge.
Coronal mass ejection, yeah.
Yeah, coronal mass ejection, and that's where Venus came from. Venus is a new planet, and that Mars was also going around Saturn, and that there was these huge electrical discharges between Venus and Mars, and that's what created this huge rift. There's a rift valley on Mars that's like incredibly huge, and that was created by this electrical discharge between Venus and Mars, and we saw all that.
You saw all that? How?
Well, every civilization on the planet has, at some point, shows all these markings, these icons of these kinds of electrical discharges that they saw. I mean, there's a great, if you go
like
to
a solar event.
It was an event that we saw. This
is really important because actually, this is
go ahead.
Coming into my mind, okay, is the Carrington event in 1859.
Right.
And the mud flood in Tartaria. Do you know about this?
Not the mud flood. I know about the Carrington event.
Do you know about Tartaria?
No.
Okay. So, Vladimir Putin just released confidential documents, declassified confidential documents around Tartaria, which was the civilization prior to the Carrington event. This is how I understand it. I may be wrong. Don't quote me on this, but here's what I've tried to figure out. And there's a lot of people doing research on this, trying to figure out what happened in the late 1800s that turned our civilization to where we are now. And here's what I can see and what I've tracked so far, okay? The Carrington event was a solar ejection. It was a solar
it was a solar flare, a large solar flare. Is what?
It hit the planet.
Yes.
Okay. I believe what happened from that, the result was a mud flood. So there were all these ornate, beautiful buildings and big, like Olympia, Washington has one. They're like huge with these columns, these large, built for giants.
Okay.
When I look back into there, I see giants and midgets and normal-sized humans all walking around together in the same space. I don't see any separation. I see lots of midgets, lots of giants, lots of regular-sized humans. All different types sized humans, all different types of things, species, like different things. Very modern civilization. Ornate buildings that were used in, like
this is in Tartaria you're talking about? Okay.
Magic was still prevalent. They had rebuilt the magic from the 1500s. 500 to 1000 AD is missing. I've only seen one thing from that time frame, which was 960 AD, which was the Mayan collapse. That's the only thing I have seen in between 500 AD and 1000 AD. It is literally locked. Don't ask me why or if it didn't exist or what happened. I don't understand in terms of a timeline what went down. However, you get to the late, mid dark ages, right? The plagues, all that. Then you come into Queen Victoria, the beginning of the alteration of the bloodlines of the royal families. That is the moment where they bred with the Rothschilds, and Victoria was born and went into power. And she was the first of that bloodline that was not officially royal, from what I understand. Within 150 years of that, the Carrington event happens. Things are going downhill. The popes are all dark. Everything is dark. Everything's going straight downhill, but we have these magnificent civilizations that have been built. There's people running around and there's all kinds of stuff happening. There's blimps, there's, you name it. And then the Carrington event happens and the mud flood happens. And all these buildings now have there's like entire floors underground where you can just see the windows at the top, which have now been turned into basement windows for most of them. But all of those floors were actually above ground at a certain point. You can see it in some of the buildings are still like that, where they have a full window and the ground comes up to here and there's this much of the window. So those basement floors weren't actually basements at all. They were actual floors. They were actually the first floor of the building, but they got covered up. And these are like in New Zealand. They're all over the world, these big, huge, ornate, beautiful buildings that were built with columns and like just incredible. It's incredible.
They dated it at that time, 1859?
So the Carrington event happened in 1859, but the mud flood, I haven't figured out when the actual mud flood happened, but there's this idea that Tartaria was this civilization that was happening where people were traveling all over the world at that point. They were moving around the world with no problem, right? And then the solar event happened and it did something electrical or whatever, because like the Industrial Revolution essentially was happening, or everything was starting to move in a technical direction, right? Into more It's also when eugenics came online during that time in the late 1800s. So what we see, though, is that the bankers, by the early turn of the century of the 1900s and the 20th century, that's when the bankers formed the banks, right? J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, and Rothschild formed the banking industry. And the SWIFT system, which is what we have been on, backed by petroleum, which is now not backed by anything. So the fiat currency we have now, it was not backed by anything at all. They took it off the petrol reliance, which was connected to the SWIFT system, which is all feeds up to two families, the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds. Two families, basically, at this point. Maybe the Morgans.
Not Soros.
Well, he's part of it. He's owned by Jacob Rothschild.
Okay.
He's his owner.
Okay.
Just saying.
Does the Pesos fit into any of this?
Say again?
The Pesos?
Pesos?
The Pesos. They're supposedly from the lineage of the Merovingians.
I don't know anything. I know about the Merovingians. I don't know what the Pesos are.
Okay, the Pesos are the, let's see, Neon Revolt did a great deep dive into it. And if you want to know more about
Pesos. Send me the link to that?
Yeah, I think I can. Yeah, there's several.
That's a little bit obscure for me to like just go and find.
Yeah, there have been several. In the Matrix also has done some research on it, but they have a huge holdings in the United States. Everything.
Doesn't surprise me in the least.
But they're also, few said P, and some people thought it was a pope, but they think that it's actually Pesos. And that their lineage is through the Merovingians, which is also the lineage of
the Christ bloodline.
Christ. Yeah, Christ bloodline. So
here I am, right? 7 royal bloodlines in my DNA, according to my mother. 2 of them on my father's side, 5 on her side.
Mm-hmm.
So I, for the longest time, only thought it was 3, right? And anything over 2, or the most concentrated version of the Anunnaki bloodlines, it's considered blood prime. They groom them to be world leaders, okay? They're groomed. I was groomed, 100%. What is important to understand, though, is that the Christ lineage in me is more predominant than the Anunnaki, but because I have so many Anunnaki as well, that's what they want, that combination, because the Christ lineage has the propensity to affect multidimensional layers of reality from the codes of light in the DNA, which is also the carrier of the blue flame, in my opinion. There's the carriers of the flame, which is the blue sphere of Amenti, which is, that's in the soul as well as in the physical DNA. So a lot of souls choose the physical DNA based on who's a carrier of the flame and who's holding the codes of light of DNA that came through the Christ lineage. So the Sophia consciousnesses, we come in and we birth into those bloodlines. And a lot of times those bloodlines have been hijacked and are married into the Anunnaki bloodlines, because they'll bring a handler in to handle the Sophia. They'll target the Sophia. So the Sophias now are coming in and saying, enough already. You're done. We're wiping you guys out of our bloodlines. Bye-bye. You're done now. And that's where we're at right now, actually, is more and more Sophias are waking up to this notion, or this idea, that they have to clear the miasms out of their bloodlines and clear the ancestral energy lineage and the descendants backwards and forwards from the Dark Lords in the DNA, which I consider the Dark Lords being like the Anunnaki. At a certain point, what happens is a Dark Lord will enter the DNA and hijack someone within that bloodline, right?
Yeah.
Maybe not even royal, but usually royal, right? But now everybody has royal lineage. Like everybody on the planet has at least one bloodline of royal. somewhere.
Yeah.
I mean, we're so spread out now that there's no way that not everybody has some level of that in their DNA, right? Like, it's there. I don't think everyone has it, but most people do. Like, so in America, I don't know about other places, but because America is such a mishmash, right? I feel like there's a lot of mixtures of bloodlines at this point. So back to what you were saying, though, about, so I was talking about Queen Victoria, right? And the popes, and Q mentioning P and you saying it's the Pacers. Now I know who you're talking about, actually. It took me a minute to understand what you were talking about, but now I recognize what you're talking about. I haven't studied that, so I really don't know. But the Merovingians are not the only Christ bloodline, right? And that's just one name for a very specific line that came from Jesus, right? And there's other lines that came through. So it's like, until we know historically how many children he actually had, and we have that physical documentation of that, and we actually know how many children he bore and she bore, Mary Magdalene, we don't actually know how many bloodlines were created. Because my understanding of him is that there were 5 children. And then I've had other times where there's 3 children. Then I've had other times where there's 1 child, Sarah, you know. So it's like, it comes through the matrilineal, specifically those Sophia energies come through the matrilineal consciousness, the mother lineage side, usually.
Yeah, well, I'm only getting my information from books and people that have written things about it. So
yeah,
so I don't have any direct knowledge, of course.
I'm all doing, this is all experiential for me. So I haven't actually read any books, which is fascinating because we're having a conversation about this. It's really interesting to me, actually, because you're having your educated version and I'm having my experiential version, and trying to figure out like what's actually real and what's not, right? We don't want to just assume something just because of whatever we read or whatever we experience. It's important to have facts, but the problem is they've hidden all that information from us for so long.
Exactly. That's why whenever new information comes in, when I hear things like from you or from other people, it's always like, okay, grain of salt,
Right.
I'm going to take it in, but I'm just going to like hold it.
Exactly.
And that's really all we can do, and just kind of let the picture kind of gradually become bigger and bigger. Now, the one thing is that when I set this up with you, I said that I needed to leave around 4:30.
You never told me that.
Oh, in the email, not the email, but the text, I said between.
I never saw that. I'm so sorry.
Oh, okay, that's all right.
I'm so sorry. So now
I
it's
said
4:30
to 4:30. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't see that.
Yeah.
When did you say that? Originally in the very beginning?
Yeah, it was you asked me when would be good, and I said,
I apologize. So what we can do is we can do a part 2. I'm happy to do that.
I'd love to do a part 2.
I would definitely love to do that. And what I might do is make this a podcast. And then when we come back on and do the physical visual again, like as a YouTube, or it's up to you, whatever you decide. But right now,
I'm happy with anything. I'm just enjoying this conversation.
Yeah, me too. I am too. And I think there's so much for us to talk about, but maybe we should focus on very specific things, and then we can break those down for people and help people understand very specific concepts, because I think that's really helpful. And I've noticed that when you break specific concepts down, it's a lot more easily digestible.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah. I'm going to let you lead the process.
Why, thank you. That's cool. I'm going to go ahead and stop this. Thank you for listening and witnessing, whoever's there right now. Thank you so much. And we're just going to stop this for now, and there'll be a part 2.
Yes. All right. Thank you.